All right, on our second to last video, we're going to start thinking about questions of racism and discrimination in society. And we're going to start off with a little bit of terminology. A lot of these words are thrown out variously, but again, in the social sciences, we want to be pretty careful about um, how we use our words because it's important if we want to study something in a systematic and scientific fashion. When we talk about prejudiced and being prejudiced, it means somebody has a set of attitudes and beliefs about another group that is um, that they are inferior or wrong or different or bad in some way, right? So this refers particularly to beliefs and attitudes. And this is a little different from discrimination, in which a group is treated differently based on gender or race or sexual orientation, for example. And the distinction here is that someone can hold prejudiced beliefs about a group, but never actually do anything to act on them, to actively discriminate. At the same time, discrimination can occur without someone being actively prejudiced and holding a set of beliefs that they're at least aware of. They may have implicit biases, as we know, but aren't actively racist or sexist in some way. So when we think about differential treatment, we can think that women are paid less than men, for example, and often their work is questioned more than men. Students in the classroom, we know black students and brown students are often treated as more problematic and as less gifted than white students. Right? Now, many of those teachers who do that probably don't hold actively racist beliefs. Some may, we would hope not. But nonetheless, we find patterns of differential treatment by those teachers. And often this happens from misleading overgeneralizations or a stereotype, an idea about a group that's not really accurate, um, but that is held in common. Um, and again, it's misleading because it's incorrect. It's not to say that we don't generalize in sociology. We do know that, for example, black children tend to perform less well in school and have lower GPA. That's not a racist stereotype, that's just a fact. The question is what it becomes racist if there's a racist belief behind it. In fact, there's a racist structure that leads to those outcomes that we'll be discussing in our class time. So when we talk about racism, we're talking about discrimination or treatment based in racial ideology or an idea of race, pardon me. This is a little bit different from ethnocentrism, which is differential treatment based on culture. For example, some people see people of the Islamic faith and culture who wrap headscarves around their head as somehow less civilized and less free. That's not necessarily based on race, on the color of their skin, but based on their cultural practices. So that would be ethnocentrism, or seeing your own ethnic group as better than others. And we can break racism historically down into two different kinds. For much of our history, we've had a kind of scientific or biological racism where we explained away racial inequality, poor conditions, less academic achievement, not earning as much money, as being rooted in some biological differences. They are genetically different and more or less inferior, it was seen. But as we mentioned in earlier videos, that's been disproven over and over again. There are no genetic commonalities among racial groups. Also, with the efforts of civil rights movements, it's become not okay to say that sort of thing, to say that one group is inferior to another. So today we live in an area of colorblind racism or symbolic racism, in which racism still occurs, but it's done in a colorblind way. So instead of saying black people should not vote, the governor of Georgia, for example, said, well, it's more efficient to close down and concentrate polling areas in certain places. And then he just happens to close down polling stations in majority black areas. He's not referring to race, to blackness as the reason, but the outcome is still racist. Someone might say, for example, that I'm not racist, but I just think that maybe they don't try as hard. Right? That whole precursor of saying I'm not racist, even though the next thing that comes is kind of racist, is because we know it's not okay to be racist, though certain forces may be trying to roll that back in our society now. Part of what we'll think about is how is colorblind racism done, both as individuals, they just want to be with their own kind, that kind of talk, but also on an institutional level. Instituting harsher penalties, for example, for crack cocaine, which doesn't directly target black folks, but indirectly does because we know that there was higher usage amongst that group. So again, it's not done in a directly racist way, but the outcome is racist. So one of the things we're going to focus in on in our class for discussion is, where does racism and discrimination come from? Do we naturally fall to in groups and out groups? Or is this something we learn? Right? Do we learn discrimination from society? Consider, when considering this question, and we'll come back to this in class, discrimination occurs within minority groups. We see things like colorism, or valuing lighter skin more. And discrimination has occurred in most societies throughout history. Does this mean it's natural, or does it mean it's learned? We'll come back to that in our in-class discussion. Right, what kinds of racism can we talk about? Well, on a larger scale, we can talk about what we call institutional racism. This means it's sort of built into the structure of an institution, like the job market or the housing market. For example, we know it's built into the labor market and to work. Black folks are paid less for the same job that white folks are and get less good jobs. If you look at this racial restrictions, this is on leasing in an old neighborhood. This is a more obvious example. It simply limits who can be leased to by their race. We see racism is built into a lot of institutions. Education. Black students are expelled more or suspended more. We'll look at this when we look directly at education. Healthcare. We see that black folks have, in recent months during the pandemic, been dying at much higher rates. That most deaths among teenagers and adolescents have been almost entirely black youth. So it's built into our health system. Why is that? We'll look at some of the complex reasons when we look at health later on. Where major companies locate their most polluting factories. Right? So here's where racism, it's not about individuals interacting or discriminating, it's kind of built into larger social structures. We also see it takes the forms of microaggressions. This refers to little racist and problematic acts that often take the form of backhanded compliments and may often go misunderstood by the people who even offer them. So one of these signs, you probably have examples of this. Do you think you can swim? The assumption is that black folks can't swim. There's a long racist history with pools in this country. Assuming that black men play sports. Or just the good old, you look pretty for a black girl. Assuming that what? Right? So these are offered as compliments, but they're often these small little racist acts that build up every day. If we go back to the discussion of health and healthcare, part of the reason why black folks die at higher rates, even without a pandemic, is that these kind of microaggressions every day create a lot of stress and anxiety. And stress and anxiety, if that's constant and builds up over time, it can have a detrimental toll on the physical body. And lastly, we want to think about privilege. Privilege is a bit of a tricky word because it implies that you're being given things in society, that you're the privileged. We think of people, being fed on silver spoons and driving around in Bentleys and kicking poor people while they laugh. Um, but privilege is a much more complex idea than that. Sort of the flip side of discrimination. Um, when we think of majority and minority, we're talking about the difference between dominant and subordinate groups. And the problem with privilege for the dominant group is that it's often unseen. Right? What that means is that if I don't have barriers in my way as a white man that a person of color does, for example, not being assumed to be capable at their job. I don't see that lack of barriers because it doesn't happen to me unless I happen to be in the same room. I don't see that. The woman, if I wasn't paying attention the other day, I might not have seen that the woman in front of me was treated differently by the cashier. She was very nice to me and very cold to the young woman who was trying to be kind to her. So part of the problem with privilege is that for those who have it's not something they see. It's often something that they don't have to deal with. Right? It's a barrier that, if you're not seeing all those barriers, then they don't exist to you. You have to read about it. You have to study it, and many people sort of choose not to. We'll look at how this works in some anecdotes in class this week.